Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, over the past 2 weeks, we've been letting the politicians from either side of this referendum debate interrogate each other over what they feel are the really big issues at stake. Today, in the last of the series, at least for now, we've invited the Green Party MP and Remain campaigner Caroline Lucas to question the Conservative minister and Leave campaigner Dominic Raab, and, of course, vice versa. They'll join me in a moment. A little earlier, we tossed a coin to see who would go first. Dominic Raab was the winner, and he chose to answer Caroline Lucas's questions first. So before we get started, let's have a listen to Dominic Raab making the case as to why undecided voters should vote to leave.
I'm ambitious for Britain. I'm confident in you, the British people. And I'm also convinced with my head and my heart that we can only reach our full potential outside the EU. Take some of the positives of leaving the EU. Our small businesses will be freed up from straitjacket regulation. That's important for us because small businesses in this country create 85% of the new jobs. We'd be freed up to trade more energetically with the growth markets of the future, from Asia to Latin America. That will cut prices in the shops. And we'd take back full control over the money we give the EU. And our gross contribution is now £350 million every week and certain to rise. When it comes to immigration, it can bring huge benefits, but only if it's properly controlled. Uncontrolled immigration from the EU has put pressure on jobs and on wages. It's also put huge strain on infrastructure, from housing to the NHS. The truth is, we can't properly control immigration unless we leave the EU. There's something bigger in this debate, something I feel with my heart. I want us to be masters of our own destiny. I want it as a citizen, as a father, and I want it for Britain for the future. And with the majority of our laws now made in Brussels by politicians and bureaucrats not elected by you and not accountable to you, we can only truly be masters of our own destiny if we vote to leave the EU on the 23rd of June and take back democratic control.
And here are Caroline Lucas and Dominic Raab. Thanks to both of you for joining. Just to explain the rules, Caroline has 5 minutes to interrogate Dominic. She can only ask questions, he can only give answers. Caroline, your time starts now.
Thank you so much. Dominic, how much is Britain's net weekly contribution to the EU?
Weekly?
Weekly net.
So the gross is 350 million and the net contribution is around half of that.
Because you'll know that on this leaflet it says, let's give our NHS the 350 million the EU takes every week. Isn't that misleading, because that isn't the real figure?
I think after almost 4 months of campaigning, the one thing people have understood is there's a difference between the gross contribution, and that includes some of the stuff that the EU spends in this country on our behalf without us being able to prioritise, as well as the amount that we actually give and we don't see back. And at the point, our point is, we want the money back that the EU spends on itself.
Do you accept this is a wrong figure? That's the key question, Dominic.
Over all of the money that we're putting in. So no, it's the gross contribution. I've made that clear.
But
I don't think there's any...
We never even send the amount from the rebate. So we can't possibly then be respending that on the NHS. So why on earth should anyone believe your side on the NHS, given that also some of the key Vote Leave campaigners are people who want to privatise the NHS?
Well, we've got a wide range of politicians involved. We've just heard from John Mann, you've got Gisela Stewart on the left, you've got some of the most left-wing unions like RMT on our side. In relation to what we've said about the NHS, we would take 100 million each week from the net contribution, and that's the allocation that would be made. But look, when you get paid your salary from the House of Commons, you get a gross figure, and there's a difference between that and what your take-home pay is. There's no real difference here.
I think we have accepted that that is a misleading figure, and I want to come on to another poster, I'm afraid, because this is another one that you'll be familiar with, that the Vote Leave side are sending around the country, and it says that Turkey is joining the EU. Now, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being 100% honest and 10 being a little bit closer to porky pies, how would you rate the suggestion in this poster that Turkey is close to becoming an EU member?
Well, it says it's joining, is joining. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that's absolutely right, and let me explain why. First of all, because it is in the process of joining. British taxpayers are already paying £1.8 billion between 2014 and 2020 to pave the way. And even as, I mean, we've had politicians from Tony Blair to David Cameron make it very clear we want Turkey, or the UK wants Turkey to join the EU, and all the while...
The UK has a veto, doesn't it? Can we just clarify? The UK has a veto, so it can't possibly join if the UK vetoes it.
So Britain has a theoretical veto.
It's not a theoretical veto,
is.
it is a real veto. And can you imagine Cyprus not vetoing this?
Well, the truth is, from Tony Blair to David Cameron, the consensus in this country has been that Turkey should join the EU. We've got our diplomats currently working on measures to expedite that happening, even as everyone says it's, you know, it's long lost. And I think the point is, you've got to just take into account what the impact that would have.
Can I just ask you one other thing?
Of
How many of the 35 chapters or areas of compliance that Turkey would have to fulfil before it could join, how many of those have been fulfilled in the last 30 years? It's been nearly 30 years since they've been trying to join. How many out of 35?
Not very many.
How many? It's one.
It's one.
It's one.
Can I answer the question?
So on
Because
that
you're
basis,
asking questions. Let me answer the question. First of all, that's why it's worrying that Whitehall and in Brussels, they're expediting Turkish membership. But I remember I was in the Foreign Office at the time when the 8 countries from Central and Eastern Europe were applying to join. In many of those cases, those box ticks criteria were ignored because the political will was there, and that's exactly what we've got now.
Would you accept that this leaflet is misleading because it makes it sound like it's going to happen sometime soon, and it clearly isn't, and Britain has a veto?
Turkish membership of the EU is a question of when, not if, and on that basis I think the poster is right.
And do you think these posters are contributing to an atmosphere of division and fear and hatred?
Come on, I think we need to be careful here. I think the responsible thing to do is to talk about immigration in a sensitive way. And I think if you ignore it and you don't talk about the costs of immigration, you're actually going to get far more fringe extremist politics. So let's try and grapple with this, not airbrush it out of the debate.
I've got 1 minute and I want to ask you two things. Key campaigners on the Leave side, like Nigel Lawson and Nigel Farage, are at best climate sceptics, if not climate deniers. Do you agree with them?
I'm not a climate sceptic at all.
So you'll have been pleased to see the climate agreement in Paris?
I think absolutely at a global level.
Did the EU play a good role?
Well, the problem we've got is that 10% of CO2 emissions comes from the EU, 90% from the rest of the world. And so we need a global, not a regional approach. And again, when I was at the Foreign Office and I dealt with a lot of global institutions, the problem is the EU is so navel-gazing and insular and inward-looking, we lose sight of the big picture, and it's global, not regional.
But the EU played a key role at Paris, didn't it, in terms of ambition, in terms of ratcheting up the ambition in Paris, yes or no?
I don't actually think that the ambition was particularly high if you look at the regions of the world outside of the EU.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you. It's now the turn of Caroline to be cross-examined. First, let's have a look at her pitch to undecided voters, arguing the case for a vote to remain.
I've got 2 sons. They're in their early 20s now. And this referendum goes to the heart of the kind of future I want for them, that all of us want for our young people and for Britain. Yet there's a risk that the outcome will be decided by older generations if young people don't get out and vote. The EU can help us build a safer, better future, because the biggest challenges we face today are by their very nature international and are best tackled by working hand in hand with our neighbours. Challenges like climate change, the refugee crisis, cross-border crime and terrorism. The EU has been a force for good, from guaranteeing workers' rights to protecting our shared environment and helping to create jobs in every part of the country. To turn our backs on this would be to turn our backs on a safer, greener, more prosperous and peaceful future. This referendum will define what kind of country our children and young people get to live in. Do we want to be an isolated, inward-looking country that cares only about what it can get out of the rest of the world? Or do we want to be a generous, outward-looking and confident country that wants to continue to play its part in making the world a better place? Let's not take our country backwards. Let's take it forwards together. I taught my children that the right thing to do when confronted with a challenge is to stand tall and find a solution, not to walk away. That's why I'm voting to remain on June the 23rd, and I'm asking you to do the same.
So, as before, Dominic, you have 5 minutes to question Caroline. Off you go.
Caroline, good morning.
Good morning.
The organisation UK in a Changing Europe, which is trying to independently verify facts for the public in this debate, they estimate that around 50 to 60% of UK laws are now made in Brussels. How high would that percentage have to be for you to be in favour of leaving the EU?
Well, I think it depends why those rules are being made in Brussels. If they're being made in Brussels, for example, because we have a single market and we want to make sure there are strong social and environmental standards, then I'm absolutely delighted that those laws are being made in Brussels. They absolutely should be. If they're there because we want to make sure that cross-border problems like air pollution are actually controlled because we've got the ability to work cross-border in the EU, absolutely it should be there. So I think just looking at bold figures doesn't help us.
So if 100% of our laws were made in Brussels, given the democratic deficit, fine by you?
Well, I think it's a bit ridiculous to think that not a single domestic law is going to be made in Britain. We know that things like housing, defence, so many issues are still decided at the UK level.
The EU taking control of defence. Where between 16% and 100% would you draw the line? I'm just trying to get a sense of when you think the tipping point arrives where we've lost so much in our democracy.
Well, I would challenge the premise of your question, because I think that actually the idea that the EU is fundamentally more undemocratic than Westminster is completely wrong. I mean, our own government, the government that you represent, was actually elected with just 24% of the eligible vote. We've got an unelected House of Lords. At least in the European institutions, we've got the Parliament that was elected through proportional representation. We've got the Council of Ministers, which means that there is a democratic oversight of the rules that are coming out of Brussels.
When do people watching this show get the chance to vote out or hold to account the 27 other heads of government in the European Council, the tens of thousands of bureaucrats in the Commission, or the 90% of MEPs not from Britain?
Well, let's talk about the bureaucrats. I mean, there are fewer people working for the European institutions in Brussels than there are for Kent County Council, for example. So this idea that there's this huge, burgeoning sense of...
But you accept the British people don't have any accountability around that? Direct control in any sense you and I would find meaningful given our relationship with our constituents?
I would be the first to say, and I've been campaigning for it for many years, that the EU should be more democratic and accountable. I should like to see the European Parliament. I was a member of the European Parliament. I would like to see the European Parliament have more powers, and I would like to see the Commission have fewer. But to suggest that that was going to be a reason for leaving the EU, I think is just wrong. We need to be in there to fight it.
Net immigration from the EU was 184,000 last year. That's the equivalent of adding a city the size of Oxford to the population each year. Now, there are benefits and costs to immigration. I know my father came here from abroad. Do you think there should be any limit on the volume of immigration from the EU? Jeremy Corbyn said no this morning. What's your view?
Well, I think it'll be self-regulating to an extent because people are coming, because we are the 5th richest country in the world, and because there are jobs here.
So we don't need a limit?
I think to have an arbitrary limit would be ineffective, and we've seen that by looking at what your own Prime Minister's tried to do by talking about bringing migration down to the tens of thousands. There's no way he's going to be able to do that because there's more migration coming from outside of the EU than there is from inside anyway.
Take Romania and Bulgaria, average wage around £3 an hour. We've got a minimum wage of £720 per hour. Strong pull factor, puts huge pressure on jobs, wages, strains on the NHS and housing. Is that just a price worth paying for staying in the EU?
Well, again, there are so many assumptions in your question. I think most of the pressure on our housing, on our education, on our health system is coming from a lack of investment and cuts from this government, not from people coming in. When it comes to the NHS, you're far more likely to be treated by someone who's come from another EU country than to find them stopping you getting closer up the queue. So I think there are some real challenges in there. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that immigration doesn't bring pressures, but what we should be doing is recognising there is a net economic benefit that migrants bring with them. Let's invest that, properly invest that in services in that area.
1 minute.
The latest report by the EU's anti-corruption body, OLAF, shows fraudulent abuse of EU funds at record levels. Transparency International has criticised the EU for not even implementing the first obligation under the UN's Convention Against Corruption. Now, under our aid policy, we wouldn't give a penny of taxpayers' money to a poor African country that wasn't trying to comply with UN standards, but we're giving billions each year to the EU. Are you comfortable with that?
I'm not comfortable with corruption or fraud wherever it happens, but I don't think that the EU has a monopoly on that, and many times the accounts haven't been able to be signed off precisely because individual nation states haven't done jobs properly. It's governments that are at fault here, not the EU.
Can I ask one last question? In your 2015 General Election Manifesto, you referred to the, I quote, EU's unsustainable economics, unquote. Do you still hold that view?
I think neoliberal economics is unsustainable, whether it's at the EU level or at British level. The best way to do that is to fight it both in Britain and in the EU, and hopefully your time's up.
It is. You're right. Thank you to both of you.